He didn't mean to save her. She didn't ask to be rescued, but one whispered sentence, "You've seen me undressed, now you must marry me," set them both on a path neither could escape. Hunted, scarred, and strangers to peace, they dared to build a life in a world that gave them none. What they found. It wasn't just survival, it was something far more dangerous: hope. Stay with us, and this is one story you won't forget. The first scream Elias Granger ever ignored still haunted him. It had been years ago. Another war, another fire, another night, when he told himself it wasn't his fight. But this one. This night in Tombstone, Arizona territory. This scream was different. It was not loud, not desperate. It was something far more unsettling. It was resigned. And that was what made him stop. The storm had passed hours earlier, but its memory clung to the air. Rain puddled in the wagon ruts along Allen Street, turning dust into treacle. Lightning had lit up the night like day not long ago, casting shadows that didn't belong to anything living. Now, the darkness was thick again, wrapping Tombstone in the kind of silence that knew too many secrets. Elias stood alone on the warped porch of the Silver Spur boarding house, the wood damp under his boots, the air cold enough to bite. He'd ridden in from Bisbee just before sunset, overseeing a delivery of flour cloth and tools. A forgettable job, a stopover, a place to sleep, then ride out by morning. But the world doesn't ask permission before changing you. Inside the lobby stank of sour beer and old sweat. A man snored on a bench by the window, the bottle still cradled in his hand. Another sat hunched in the corner with the slack jaw of someone long past caring. Elias passed them both. The innkeeper's office was said to be down the hall. Then he heard it. A sound no man should hear and walk past. A sound that didn't belong in a place where people paid for rest. It wasn't loud, it wasn't a cry for help, it was a single word, sharp, stifled female. It was no, and it wasn't meant for him. But it reached him anyway. He paused at the second door on the left. The paint peeled like skin. The latch hung loose. Something deep inside him, something he thought long buried, stirred. He pushed the door open. The room was barely big enough for a cot and a basin. It smelled of damp cloth and things left to rot. No windows except a nailed-shut slit above the bed. And in the far corner, crouched low, was a woman. She wasn't weeping, she wasn't pleading. She was watching him with eyes that looked carved from obsidian. Her shift was torn, barely hanging off her shoulder. Her long black hair clung to her skin. She looked about 20, maybe less. Her hands gripped the edge of the cot as if it might float her away. But her face, that face, didn't beg. "You've seen me undressed," she said, voice quiet and precise. "Now you must marry me." Elias blinked. Not out of confusion, but because something in him had broken free like a fault line deep under the desert. "What did you say?" he asked. "If you don't, they'll punish us both. You know how men like them work." And he did. Too well. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. A man's voice slurred, "Time's up, Apache." Elias didn't hesitate. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him. His hand went to the nearest chair, wedging it under the knob. The hallway noise grew louder. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nayeli." He took off his coat, handed it to her. She paused, then pulled it over herself with deliberate dignity. He moved to the tiny window and slid a knife between the frame and the swollen wood. Paint cracked. With a shove, the sash gave. The door rattled behind him. "You think she's yours now, cowboy?" Elias lifted Nayeli gently, hands respectful, and helped her through the window. Then he followed, landing in the alley behind the boarding house. The wind carried the scent of wet mesquite and blood. The street beyond was empty. They ran, past barrels and rain-slick cobblestones, past the saloon's back entrance and the old livery stable. Shouts rang out behind them, angry, slurred, promising retribution. But the sound grew fainter with every turn of the wagon wheels. Elias had reached the freight yard, hoisted her into the back of his rig, and cracked the reins before the first boot hit the alley. The horses surged forward. The canvas flap fell. They didn't speak, not until Tombstone was just a smear in the distance. Then Nayeli said, "You didn't have to do that." Elias kept his eyes ahead. "I know. You could have left me there." "I know that too." "Then why didn't you?" He didn't answer right away. The wind swept in across the open land, brushing the wagon wheels like a prayer. "Because he said at last I've walked away from too many screams. Not this time." She looked at him. Then, not with gratitude, not with fear, but with a kind of cautious wonder. The desert stretched ahead, wide, silent, waiting. And the man, who had only planned to deliver a wagon load of supplies, found himself delivering something else entirely. A woman from a cage, a promise, without words, and a story he hadn't meant to start. But now that it had begun, there would be no stopping it. No forgetting it, no turning back. The first light of morning broke behind them, chasing shadows across the sand. And somewhere deep inside Elias, in a place untouched by years of war and wandering, something steady took root. He didn't know what this journey would demand of him. But he knew this the moment he stepped into that room. His life had changed forever. The desert doesn't just test a man's body, it tests his soul. Somewhere between the burning silence of Tombstone and the broken horizon to the north, Elias Granger began to feel something shift. The wheels of his wagon carved narrow furrows into ground older than memory, and every hoofbeat against stone was like the tick of a clock, counting down a life he no longer understood. Nayeli sat beneath the canvas cover behind him, wrapped in his trail coat. She hadn't spoken much since they'd escaped the boarding house, and Elias hadn't forced it. There was a weight in silence, sometimes heavier than words. He knew because he carried his own. But still, he'd glance back now, and then not to check on her like a burden, but to make sure the quiet hadn't swallowed her whole. The days were long and dry, stretching endlessly under a sun that didn't blink. The nights were sharp, with cold, filled with wind and memories neither of them invited. But it wasn't the elements that wore on them. It was what rode behind. Somewhere out there someone still hunted them. Elias could feel it like a thorn buried just under the skin, present, invisible, dangerous. On the third day, she fell ill. It came on quick, a tightness in her chest, sweat on her brow despite the chill. Her lips cracked, her hands trembled. Elias stopped the wagon beneath a rocky outcrop, where a trickle of water gathered in a natural basin. He laid her down on the wagon bed and covered her with both blankets. Her breathing came shallow lips, whispering words in a language he didn't know. He couldn't stay put. Not with her like that. Not knowing if help would come. So he rode. He left her hidden in the shadows and took the fastest horse into a settlement, 2 valleys over, barely more than a church and a watering hole, where he found an old woman who called herself Madre Luz. She gave him a tin of herbs instructions and a look that cut deep. "Don't let her fade," she told him. "Not if you mean to carry her story alongside your own." He rode harder back than he had going out. All through that night, Elias stayed by her side, dampening a cloth, whispering words he didn't believe in case someone was listening. And just before the first sliver of dawn, her eyes fluttered open. She was too weak to speak, but her fingers found his. The next day she sat upright, thin, pale, but alive. That was when she finally spoke again. "You came back. I said I would. You didn't know me. I do now." After that, the trail changed, not in shape, but in how it felt. They were still being chased, but they were no longer just running. They were learning each other. She asked to learn how to throw a knife. He asked her to teach him how to read tracks in the dust. She showed him which cactus carried water and which ones lied. He showed her how to keep the saddle tight and spot danger in the horizon's heat shimmer. They became quiet companions, not because they feared speaking, but because sometimes silence said what hearts couldn't. One evening they camped near the skeleton of a wagon, long since abandoned. The fire crackled low. Elias sharpened his knife while Nayeli stitched the seam of the coat he'd given her. She worked like someone who had patched too many things in her life, clothes, plans, people. I used to think, she said softly, that if I stayed quiet enough, the world wouldn't notice me. He looked at her. Did it work? No. Her smile was small. The world noticed, and it didn't care. But I did, he replied. For the first time, she didn't look away. They shared a meal of dried meat and hard bread, softened in water, and when Elias handed her the larger piece, she hesitated. You didn't have to give me more. You needed more, he said. I noticed you did that the last 2 days. He shrugged. I guess I hoped you'd notice. She held his gaze. I notice everything. The moon hung low that night, a soft white eye, watching from above. They lay on opposite sides of the fire, but neither of them truly slept. The night pressed close, whispering that this road was only going to get harder, and yet for the first time they didn't seem alone in it. By the next afternoon they crested a rise and looked down into a valley dotted with green. Elias pointed toward the far end, where a narrow stream wound between the cottonwoods. We'll stop there for a spell. Let the horses drink. You can rest. Nayeli nodded. And you? He looked at her, then at the trail behind them. I'll rest when I know we're not being followed. She didn't argue. She just reached out and handed him the water canteen before he could ask. As they rode down, a dust cloud rose far in the distance. Too small to be a storm, too steady. Elias's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but he urged the horses faster. Nayeli noticed. She didn't ask. She simply sat straight, her eyes forward, scanning the land like she'd done it all her life. That night, beneath the cottonwoods as the fire burned low, she said something that made him pause. If they catch us, I'll fight. I won't be taken again, I know. You don't have to protect me like a child. I'm not, he said. I'm protecting you like a man who's done too little good and doesn't want to waste the chance to do one thing right. She didn't respond, but when she lay down that night, she moved her bedroll a little closer to his. And for Elias, that was enough. The distance between them wasn't as wide as it had been the day before, and with each mile, each shared silence, that gap continued to close. The desert still waited ahead, but so did something else. Something neither of them dared name, at least not yet. There's a moment in every long journey when the road forks, not always in sight, but in the soul. And when it does something inside a person, either hardens or softens. On the edge of the Arizona territory, where the desert gave way to scraggly pine and low hills, Elias Granger felt that moment come. It didn't arrive with thunder or revelation. It came quiet, like the way old pain settles in your bones before a storm. The trail had led them north, away from the worst of the heat, but deeper into questions neither of them dared ask aloud. Days had passed since Nayeli had sat up after her fever. She was stronger now, walking further from the wagon, even humming to herself when she thought he couldn't hear. But the sound only deepened the ache in Elias's chest. Not sadness, not quite. It was something else, something like longing for a life he'd once been told he didn't deserve. They came upon a group of settlers one afternoon, near a crooked bend in the trail. It was a friendly camp full of voices, smoke from beans simmering in iron pots, and the clatter of wagon wheels being repaired. The kind of place where strangers were offered coffee before questions. Elias introduced himself, and without hesitation introduced Nayeli as his wife. The word felt strange in his mouth, not because it was untrue, but because of how true it had started to feel. She said nothing when he spoke it, only nodded her eyes, steady her hand, not letting go of his. That night, by the fire, children danced barefoot in the dirt, and the older folks passed around a bottle of sweet corn whiskey. Nayeli smiled wide and real. She laughed when one of the children wrapped a string of dried flowers around her wrist. Elias couldn't stop watching her. Not like a man claiming something, but like a man finally seeing something rare in the wild and knowing enough to be still. Later, they sat by the wagon, just the two of them. The music from the camp still drifted nearby. "I didn't correct you," she said softly. "Didn't expect you to. You think I'm your wife now." He didn't answer right away. "I think I've called men friends with less than what we've already shared." The silence between them wasn't cold. It was full thick with thoughts neither could quite give voice to. That same night the past came creeping. Two men on horseback. One of them, Elias recognized immediately, the man from the boarding house hallway, the one who laughed when he pounded on Nayeli's door. They didn't ride into the settler camp. They circled, watching, measuring. Elias didn't sleep. By morning he had the wagon packed and horses ready. He didn't tell the settlers why they were leaving so suddenly, just thanked them and promised to pay kindness forward. Nayeli didn't ask questions. She knew that kind of silence. It was the kind that meant danger was close. As they rolled out of camp, she said, "You could leave me somewhere. You'd be safer. You still think I'm the kind of man who wants safe." She didn't press again. The road ahead bent through a grove of cottonwoods where the light fell in golden columns. They stopped there to water the horses, and she sat on a stump twisting something small between her fingers. It was a lock of her hair braided with a thin strip from the blue shirt he'd let her wear. "What's that?" he asked. "A token," she said. "Yaqui women make them when they have no wedding band. It doesn't mean I'm yours. It means I choose not to be alone." She tied it around his wrist. "I won't take anything from you," he said, "unless it's freely given." "It is. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to." That night they made camp far from the trails, tucked between two ridges that hadn't seen feet in years. Nayeli built the fire. Elias set traps for game. They worked without speaking, like two hands that knew the same rhythm. As they ate, he asked, "What would you do if no one hunted you? If you woke up tomorrow and the past couldn't find you?" She stirred the beans. "I'd plant something. Not because I like farming, but because it means I'd expect to still be around to see it grow." He nodded slowly. "You'd be good at that." She looked over. "And you." He thought for a long moment. "I'd build a place. 4 walls, a roof that doesn't leak, a porch, someplace where nobody needed to hide." She smiled. "You're more of a dreamer than you pretend to be." "I dream simple. And you think simple's enough." He met her eyes. "It might be if you're standing next to me." A chill wind blew through the canyon that night, stirring the coals. Elias added more wood, watched the sparks dance. In the distance, a coyote howled, but it didn't feel like a warning this time. It felt like a reminder that the land watched everything, and sometimes it watched with kindness. Before they turned in, Nayeli walked to the wagon and returned with the same shirt she'd worn when they met, now mended and folded. "I'm keeping this," she said. "Not because it was torn, but because I fixed it." Elias stood. "Seems fair." She handed it to him. "We'll both need reminders of who we were before all this. Not to forget, but to remember how far we came." He looked down at the cloth and back to her. "Then, let's make sure we keep moving forward. together. And for the first time since that night in Tombstone, neither of them felt like they were running. They were walking toward something, and that made all the difference. Some battles don't begin with gunfire. Some start with silence, the kind so heavy it presses against your ribs like a warning. That's what Elias Granger felt as the wagon creaked into the red cliffs of Sedona. The air there carried an eerie stillness, like the land itself was holding its breath. He had seen a lot in his years: war betrayal, the worst of what men could do when no one was looking, but something about this place made him sit straighter in the saddle and keep one hand near the rifle. He didn't tell Nayeli that he'd chosen this canyon for a reason. It wasn't just shelter. It was a place that could become a wall. The narrow entrance the high rock faces, it meant the men chasing them would have to come straight in. No circling, no flanking, no tricks, just one last confrontation face to face. He'd seen their dust for 2 days now, hovering on the horizon like smoke from a fire you can't put out. It was the same group 3 riders, hard men with nothing to lose. The one in the lead wore a grin that Elias had memorized back in Tombstone, the same sneer that had haunted that hallway outside Nayeli's room. Now that grin was coming for them again. Elias stopped the wagon at the base of a sheer cliff, using the rock face to hide their camp. As he unhitched the team, Nayeli appeared beside him. She hadn't asked questions since they turned west into this dead-end stretch, but now she did. Why here? He kept his eyes on the reins. Because if they're going to come, I want them where I can see them. She didn't flinch. You're planning to fight. I'm planning to end this. That night, they built a fire low and tight to the rock. No light escaped into the canyon beyond. They ate quietly jerky and beans, each bite heavy with unspoken thoughts. When Elias stood to check the rifle, Nayeli reached into her pouch and pulled out something small. It was a knife. Bone-handled, Yaki-made. I won't wait behind a rock, she said. I've run enough. He looked at her. Truly looked. Her face hardened by loss, weathered by survival, still carried the fire of someone who hadn't given up. He nodded. You stay close, he said. I'll stay alive, she replied. The next morning came slow. The air was cold and the sky hung low like it knew what was coming. Elias paced the entrance to the canyon. He had set up barrels from the wagon to use as cover. The rifle was loaded. The revolver was clean, and his heartbeat was steady, calmer than it had any right to be. By midday, the sound of hooves reached them. Distant then, louder, then echoing like thunder down the rock walls. 3 riders entered just as expected. They didn't hesitate. The leader pulled up, spitting to the side. Told you we'd be seeing you, freight man. Elias stood from behind the wagon, rifle leveled. She's not yours to take. The man laughed. You think saying she's your wife makes a difference? Elias didn't blink. No, but this will. He fired. The shot struck the dirt inches in front of the man's horse, causing it to rear. The others fanned out, but the canyon walls held them tight. The second shot grazed one rider's shoulder. He screamed, falling from his saddle. The last rider raised his gun, but before he could aim, Nayeli stepped out from behind the wagon. Calm, controlled. The knife in her hand flew straight. It sank deep into the man's leg. He howled, dropping his gun. Only the leader remained stunned, watching his plan unravel. Elias stepped forward, rifle still up. You're done. The man looked at the 2 of them, bloodied steady, unbroken, and saw something he hadn't expected. Conviction. He turned and fled, leaving his companions groaning in the dust. Silence returned thick as the morning fog. Elias exhaled, his shoulders sagging for the first time in days. Nayeli came to stand beside him, her hand brushing his. It's over, she said. He shook his head. Not over, but different now. They cleaned the wounds, left the canyon without looking back. As the red rocks faded behind them, so did the shadow of fear. That night, camped beside a stream, Nayeli took a piece of red thread and tied it around Elias's wrist. In my mother's tradition, she said, we tie a thread when something has been survived, when a promise has been made. What promise that we'll stop surviving and start living? He looked down at the thread, then at her. That's one I can keep. They didn't say the word love. Not yet. But the fire between them didn't need naming, and as they lay beside each other under the stars, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Real peace, the kind that doesn't need a reason. Only a person willing to stay when everything else says run. And in that stillness beneath that night sky, Elias finally believed he wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was home. Even if they hadn't found a place yet, he had found her. And that made all the difference. Sometimes peace doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, like a breeze shifting through the grass or a stream murmuring between stones. That's how it came to Elias and Nayeli, as a whisper, not a shout. And by the time they reached the mouth of Verde Valley after so many days riding towards something unnamed, they both knew. They had found it. The valley opened like a book nobody had finished writing. Cottonwoods lined the river in lazy curves, their green leaves dancing in a breeze that smelled of water and earth. Birds called out in the high branches. The soil was rich, dark, full of promise. For the first time in weeks, Elias reined in the horses, not because they were tired, but because he was. He looked over at Nayeli. She sat beside him on the wagon bench, her eyes scanning the land the same way his did. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. There was something in the way her shoulders lowered, the way her breath slowed, that told him everything. "This place," he said. She nodded. "It doesn't feel borrowed." They set up camp under the arms of a wide oak. Elias unharnessed the team and let them drink freely from the nearby stream. Nayeli gathered stones to build a fire pit, her movements quiet but purposeful. They didn't talk about staying. Not yet. But they both moved like people who didn't plan to leave. That night, as the fire crackled low, Elias unfolded a piece of canvas and laid it out beside the wagon. "We could build here," he said. "Small place. Nothing fancy, but strong." Nayeli looked at him, her eyes catching the firelight. "With a garden," she said. He smiled. "And a porch." They slept close that night, the stars overhead and the sound of the river in their ears. There was no fear, no running. Just two people who had outrun enough storms to finally rest. In the days that followed, they began to build. Elias used what he had in the wagon, spare timber tools, even nails he'd been saving for years. Nayeli cleared a patch of ground near the stream and planted seeds she'd carried in a small leather pouch since before Tombstone. Each day they woke early, worked hard, and went to sleep with sore hands and full hearts. Neighbors weren't close in this stretch of land, but now and then riders passed through. A few locals stopped by out of curiosity, drawn by the sight of smoke rising from a new chimney. Elias greeted them with calm, and Nayeli met them with strength. They didn't tell the full story, but they didn't lie either. Folks seemed to sense that something sacred had taken root here, and they respected it. One afternoon, after they'd set a beam for the roof, Elias pulled out a small tin box from the bottom of the wagon. Inside was an old coin, one he'd carried through war and wandering. He'd shaved it down, shaped it, turned it into a simple ring. He handed it to Nayeli. "It's not silver," he said, "but it's honest." She held it for a long moment, then slid it onto her finger. "It's enough," she said. They didn't speak vows. They didn't need to. Every nail they drove into wood, every row of seeds they laid, every meal they shared by the fire, those were the promises. and they were stronger than any ceremony. As weeks passed, the house grew. So did the life around it. Birds made nests in the trees nearby. Rabbits dared the garden's edge. The soil gave sprouts, then blossoms. Elias carved their initials into a beam above the door. Nayeli taught the neighbors' children a few Yaqui words, and Elias taught them how to carve arrow shafts from willow. It wasn't fast, it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. One night, long after sunset, they sat on the porch, their hands still dusty from the day's work. The moonlight spilled across the grass, silvering the land. "Do you ever think about Tombstone?" Nayeli asked. "Sometimes," Elias said, "but it feels like another life." "It was," she said. "This one's ours." They sat in silence, after that the kind that doesn't press or weigh down. The kind that says, "We've made it." And then far off the faint sound of hooves, distant, fading, moving on. Elias didn't stand. He didn't reach for his rifle. He just listened. Then turned to her. "Doesn't matter anymore," he said. Nayeli nodded. They already lost. That night, as they lay together in the small cabin with unfinished walls, the wind carrying the scent of pine and rain, Elias understood something he'd never let himself believe before. He was no longer a man surviving. He was a man living. And in the woman beside him, in the earth beneath him, in the quiet above him, he had found something he hadn't dared hope for. A place to stay, and someone to stay for. In the weeks that followed, Elias and Nayeli continued shaping the land as it shaped them. They added a small corral for a pair of goats traded from a traveling rancher. Nayeli began teaching nearby women how to grow herbs that could treat sickness. Elias fixed wagons for passing riders, never asking for much just news from outside, and a moment to share coffee beneath the eaves. They never put up a sign. They didn't need one. Those who came knew they were welcome, so long as their hands were clean and their hearts honest. One evening, as the last light faded, Elias caught Nayeli standing by the stream, hands clasped before her. She was humming a tune he didn't recognize but somehow understood. It was a song for the soil, for survival, for all the pieces of herself she had reclaimed. When she turned to him, she said, "I never believed I'd get to choose what kind of woman I wanted to be." He stepped toward her, touched her hand. "You chose. You fought for it. And now you're her." She smiled, leaning into him. "And you, Elias, didn't answer right away." He looked out over the darkening field, the stars beginning to bloom. "I used to think I was just passing through this life, like a shadow across someone else's story. But not anymore. Now I know. I was always meant to stop here." Their home stood behind them, not just wood and stone, but memory and choice. The kind of home built not by accident, but by two people who stopped running. Together. Elias Granger and Nayeli didn't begin their story as lovers. They began as two people thrown together by violence, desperation, and the cruel randomness of life on the frontier. But what they built slowly, with bruised hands and guarded hearts, was not a tale of rescue, but of reclamation. Elias had seen enough of war and death to last 10 lifetimes. He was a man shaped by scars, haunted by the things he'd chosen to walk away from and the things he hadn't. His life was built on the idea that nothing lasted, that everything you tried to hold would slip away eventually. But then came a night in Tombstone when he didn't walk away. When a quiet voice said, "You've seen me undressed. Now you must marry me." And he stayed. Nayeli, too, was no stranger to loss. Taken from her, people passed like a token between men who saw her not as a person but a prize. She learned early that survival didn't come from strength alone. It came from learning when to hide, when to resist, and when to speak. She didn't expect kindness. She didn't ask for it. But when Elias offered not safety, but respect, when he risked everything to open that window and lift her to freedom, something shifted in her world. Their journey north was more than a path across dirt and rock. It was a journey inward. Elias learned to let someone in to offer more than duty. Nayeli learned to trust without giving up her autonomy. Together, they built trust, not through grand gestures but through shared meals, mended coats, long silences, and the steady rhythm of survival. They were hunted. They were tested. And yet they chose again and again not to run from each other but toward something they could only build together. By the time they reached Verde Valley, the dust of pursuit had settled, and what remained was more than peace. It was possibility. They built a home not out of wood alone, but out of choice. A home without walls of fear. A life shaped not by what they had escaped, but by what they wanted to become. Elias laid beams with the same hands that had once pulled triggers. Nayeli planted herbs with the same hands that had once fended off harm. And in doing so, they turned pain into purpose. So what do we learn from them, these two wandering souls who found something lasting in a world built to take everything away? We learn that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just staying when it would be easier to run. Sometimes it's picking up a hammer instead of a rifle. Sometimes it's admitting that you want more than just survival. We learn that love doesn't always arrive as thunder or lightning. Sometimes it's a steady presence, a shared look, a fire built together, a hand reached out in quiet offering. And most of all, we learn that healing is possible, not fast, not perfect, but real. We can begin again, even with scars, especially with scars. In our modern world, where people are still running from pain, from the past, from each other, the story of Elias and Nayeli speaks with timeless truth. It tells us that safety isn't a place on a map, it's a person who sees you, respects you, and walks beside you. That love worth keeping comes not from rescue but from recognition. So if you find yourself wondering if there's a place where you belong, remember this story. Remember that even in the wildest lands, even in the harshest times, two people with nothing can build something that means everything. If their story stirred something in you, if it made you believe even for a moment that hope can grow where pain once lived, then don't let it stop here. Help us keep these stories alive. Subscribe to our channel to support the voices of resilience, of honor, of love, forged in the dust and shaped by the hand of destiny. Every subscriber helps us bring you more tales that echo across time and speak to the deepest parts of who we are. Thank you for riding with us. And remember, some stories never end. They just find a place to stay. Subscribe now. Let's keep the legend alive.